Next video, Resident Evil 4, what happened? Don't know what this video is about, but we'll see.
4, Capcom's legendary entry in its long-running horror franchise. It's known far and wide for saving or ruining the series, depending on which splinter group of fans you talk to, with the latter one being wrong. I've been wanting to make a video on RE4's you talk to.
Just another brainless shooter amongst a myriad of other brainless shooters? What?
With the latter one being wrong. I've been wanting to make a video on RE4's exhaust.
People really didn't like the transition into the 3D world, did they? Like the move away from like tank control, like exploratory mystery stuff. People did not like that transition when it first happened.
Road to release for years, and now it just seemed like a good time. Like it felt right, you know? No other specific reason.
Well, wasn't there tank controls in in the 2D stuff, right? Or I mean, like, yeah, like the new FPS over the shoulder thing, like that kind of tank controls. People miss the original like forced perspective, you're the camera on the wall type thing. And then when RE4 came out, they got rid of that forced perspective camera on the wall thing. And because of that, people did not like that. They were pretty unhappy about that transition. You missed that as well in some ways. I'm a really big disliker of that, actually. I'm really not a big fan. Like, at all.
And before you say something, yes, it's one of the best games of all time. No one's debating that at all, like ever. Its quality is not in question here. This is about its incredibly protracted development history that's filled with as many bumps, twists, and turns as Leon's own wacky European vacation.
What the hell are you doing?
So slip on your favorite bomber jacket and load your broken butterflies as I answer the question, what happened to
Resident Evil?
Yeah, I got you.
Cogedlo.
Resident Evil 4.
To properly set the stage and do this story the justice it deserves, we have to go back to...
I'll say this. I still prefer Leon's original voice actor. That's probably a hot take, but it's how I feel.
To a specific point in time, which of course
Leon!
would be...
1998.
The idea that Resident Evil 2 was a bit of a milestone moment for the series was, and always will be, a massive understatement. Its commercial success was so crazy, so all-encompassing that it basically caused Capcom to prioritize RE over every other one of their franchises in the late 90s and early 2000s. And hell, you can still make that argument today. Profits from both their fighting games and Mega Man sequels were quickly declining in the late 90s, so when survival horror took a big bite out of the industry, something which elevated the company as a whole, Capcom was gonna milk that cow-based BOW for as long as it possibly could. So with the sequel's success, they greenlit several new projects all at once, an N64 and Dreamcast port of RE2, RE0, Code Veronica, a new mainline sequel for the PlayStation, and on top of them all, Resident Evil Gaiden.
Ugh, it stinks.
It goes without saying, but piecing together development history of any RE game is kinda like an irritating slide puzzle. So for some of the following information, I turn to Itchy Tasty, an unofficial history of Resident Evil by CVX freak himself, Alex Aniel, which chronicles the entire first decade of survival horror. Do check it out in the description below. Even with that resource though, there's still always lots of additional nuggets of info hiding in obscure magazine interviews throughout the years, so big ups to Newsbot down at projectumbrella.net for helping me track those down. Now, just slightly before RE2's mammoth success, while it was still being finished up after its reboot, RE3 was already in the planning stages, with Masaki Yamada, an event director on RE1, in the director's chair. The game's scenario is set to take place on a derelict ship involving a new hero, an even hunk, but didn't even get far enough for the team to determine whether it should have used 3D or pre-rendered backgrounds. When RE2 then did finally hit store shelves and made Capcom tons of bank, Hideki Kamiya became their new golden boy, replacing Yamada as director of RE3, and was given
Didn't Hideki Kamiya make DMC stuff? I could have sworn.
lots of free reign on what this next mainline entry would look like. Work began anew officially in 1998, with the old scenario being thrown out, or possibly being reused for Dead Aim, but very quickly Kamiya realized
Yeah,
that
he totally did. I remember this face. I remember this face.
he wouldn't be able to top what he had achieved with RE2 if it was to remain on the original.
If you didn't know this, by the way, fun fact, as someone who looks at a lot of Devil May Cry stuff, Devil May Cry was originally supposed to be a Resident Evil clone. Just so you know. It started off as a Resident Evil clone, and then it had changed over development into what it became, DMC1.
PlayStation. He instead wanted to move development over to the then upcoming PlayStation Double Balling, which of course would have allowed for far more advancements. Sony had announced that their sophomore machine would only be hitting the market in the later half of 2000, which meant that a numerical sequel to Resident Evil 2 would take a lot longer than initially expected. Yoshiki Okamoto, who was the general producer of Capcom's console output at that time, did not want rival companies like Square or Konami to overtake them in the horror space. So while Kamiya's team were cooking, Okamoto decided they would release even more ports and spin-offs to keep the franchise at the forefront of gamers' minds, although some of these projects may not be worth remembering.
Now stay back! Don't come any closer!
I know you think that I'm a murderer, but you're wrong.
One such spin-off was a game known internally as Resident Evil 1.9, which was intended to be a small-scale prequel of sorts using much of the same technology and assets from RE2, and thus was scheduled to be finished in about 12 months. 1.9's original scenario placed it one day before the events of Resident Evil 2, hence the 1.9 moniker, but this eventually changed into the final title of Biohazard Last Escape in Japan and Resident Evil Nemesis in North America. 3 months before the game was completed, however, Okamoto approached Resident Evil producer Shinji Mikami and Nemesis's director Kazuhiro Oyama and explained they needed a big money spinner for their 1999 fiscal year, especially since Capcom was on the precipice of becoming a publicly traded company. He proposed that Nemesis should be rebranded as the next numerical sequel, something that both Mikami and Oyama were very hesitant over. The game had been designed pretty frugally, introduced some vastly different mechanics, skewed a bit more towards action, and was much shorter overall, so they were worried fans
I think this game's like 8 hours, 6 hours long total.
would be disappointed if it became Resident Evil 3. Okamoto, though, wasn't really suggesting this because it was more or less a direct order. The ripple effects of this decision were pretty widespread and are relevant to our story today because it meant that Kamiya and his team were no longer working on Resident Evil 3, they're now jumping ahead to its sequel, Resident Evil 4, and in typical Kamiya fashion, it was going to be its very own, very different thing.
You see, he even put the reference
Very
there.
own, very
There he is. There's our boy in the bottom right-hand corner.
different thing. As the shepherd of the franchise, Mikami first mentioned to the press back in 1999 that a new mainline Resident Evil game was in development for the PS2, with Kamiya at the head of the project. What Mikami didn't let slip was that it was the director's goal to turn the franchise on its head, completely redesigning how it would play and feel. Kamiya was aiming for a gothic setting and even took research trips to Europe so they could gather appropriate reference materials. RE4's scenario was being handled by both Yasuhisa Kawamura, who had previously worked on Nemesis, and Noboru Sugimura, the scriptwriter who had helped flesh out RE2's story. The earliest iteration of this project actually revolved around Leon S. Kennedy, investigating an old castle owned by Oswell E. Spencer, and would have put forward the idea that the two were somehow related.
What a touching moment we have here.
This was soon dropped, as Kamiya eventually realized if he wanted to keep the series fresh, they needed to place emphasis on brand new characters and story ideas. He also wanted to present a truly cool and stylish hero, which isn't something you could honestly say about the bumbling rookie cop version of Mr. Kennedy.
That can't be. I know her. Ada wouldn't do something like that.
Thus, Leon was dropped in favor of one Tony Redgrave, who came locked and loaded with superhuman abilities via a cocktail of viruses and biotech upgrades to his body, which let him stylishly kill enemies via guns and even melee weapons. Kamiya also wanted to dispense with the pre-rendered backgrounds, and for his vision of the combat to work, tank controls absolutely had to go. These were obviously all pretty massive changes to the formula, but in his defense, Kamiya was just adhering to what his boss had told him. On the project's outset, Mikami had reportedly said, "Do whatever you like, it doesn't even have to be a horror game." Now, maybe he was joking, because the next time Mikami did check in on the team's progress, he most likely said something along the lines of, what the fuck? As Kamiya had indeed done whatever he liked. Sure, there were still spooky environments, fixed camera angles, and puzzles to solve, but the moment-to-moment gameplay was balls-to-the-wall action. Thing is, though, it was fun, but so far removed from what players would be expecting that Mikami felt they couldn't in good conscience call it Resident Evil. Shinji and Hideki then put their heads together to come up with a solution, which wound up being to simply spin the project off into its own standalone franchise, which, as I'm sure most of you know by now, became Despite this being an obvious setback for the Resident Evil brand in the
I'm
short
so happy
term,
they're talking
it
about
also
this.
presented an opportunity for Capcom. Since there was no longer a big mainline entry currently in the pipeline, Mikami and Okamoto wanted to see if they could fish for a more lucrative deal for their survival horror juggernaut. RE had become the hottest Capcom property since Street Fighter II, so they were betting there was a publisher willing to shell out for exclusivity. Another factor to this decision was that Mikami had become unsure about Sony's approach to game development, feeling that the DVD format they were pushing fell outside the realm of gaming, and finding Nintendo's proprietary discs far more intriguing. Even so, he wanted to see what both of Sony's competitors could offer, what their design philosophies were, and how it could benefit Resident Evil. So, around Christmas of 2000, Mikami met with representatives from both Nintendo and Microsoft, with MSVP of Third-Party Relations Kevin Bacchus scheduled first, which famously did not go very well. Translators were unprepared for Mikami's questions, and Bacchus wasn't really in a good position to give the right answers, so Mikami just bounced, leaving the meeting with a quick bow. By the time Microsoft realized just how badly they screwed this up and called Capcom to reschedule for a second meeting, Resident Evil had already become a Nintendo exclusive. Once this deal became official, Sony Interactive Entertainment president and father of the PlayStation, Ken Kutaragi, invited Capcom higher-ups to an awkward dinner where he subtly accused them of betraying Sony despite a lack of any actual deal or contract in place. Capcom pointed out that the PS2 remained their priority, as they were set to continue developing more titles for it than the GameCube and Xbox combined. It should be noted that this betrayal didn't result in any long-term bad blood between Capcom and Sony, considering what would happen later on. With this Nintendo deal absolutely super ironclad with no way it'll ever be broken, Mikami got to work on his own new project, remaking the game that started it all, exclusively for the GameCube. But he also needed to put together a team to restart development on RE4, since Kamiya was busy with other things.
Fill your dark soul with light!
Best
Hiroshi
scene in
Shibata,
gaming.
a Nemesis background designer, was chosen to lead this new project, with Sugimura and Kawamura transferring over from Kamiya's team. This new story treatment was very similar to the last one, seeing Leon infiltrate a castle owned by crazy old Oswald Spencer and getting infected and or possessed in the process. This possession apparently manifested into some type of power within Leon's left hand, which in an old EGM interview with producer Hiroyuki Kobayashi was cited as the twist of the game. Kobayashi also revealed that Leon was originally going to explore a laboratory deep within the estate, where he would come across an unnamed female character who had a dog-based BOW acting as her protector. That last detail wasn't present in the eventual.
I think that's a reference to what happened later on, because there's another game, I can't remember the name of the game. There's another game that was inspired by Resident Evil where you play as a girl who walks through a castle and is chased by a fucking huge ass dude. And I think she has a dog as a protector. I can't remember the name of it though.
Trailer that was released to the public in 2002 during the Capcom 5 announcement, but Mikami would declare that Resi 4 would still represent a full model change for the franchise. This first iteration, or second if you count Kamiya's initial attempt, which some people don't, is known as the Fog version due to the black smoke-like enemy that Leon fights in said trailer. It should be noted, however, that this was a name given by the press and fans because the team itself dubbed it Castle or Castle Awakening. The reasoning behind this build getting cancelled is still not 100% clear, but the most common answer seems to be that the team were targeting a number of ambitious special effects that were simply too ambitious. Rendering the Black Fog enemy in a realistic way was apparently too much to properly realize on the GameCube, so at around 40% completion, almost everything was thrown out. Some of that scrapped material was the possessed hand and girl with dog stuff, which seemed to be Sugimura creations because they went away when he departed to pursue other projects. Kawamura then took over writing duties and started layering more elements on top of the Leon investigates creepy plays template that they seem to be sticking with. For all you dog lovers out there though, don't fret, you got a canine companion in Haunting.
This is the game. That's the game right there. This is exactly the game. It's weird how I'm predicting all this shit, man. This man's in my fucking head.
Ground/Demento, which Sugimura is credited on as the draft scenario writer, so it's possible he decided to reuse those ideas there. This then kicked off the new iteration, which would be less concerned with fighting the forces of bioterrorism and more about fighting the forces of the supernatural, or so it seemed. While we don't know a lot about the narrative from this version of the game, it saw Leon trying to survive various ghouls and or ghosts in some type of haunted building or perhaps the same castle. This version is commonly known as Hookman because in addition to stuffed animal heads and killer dolls, Leon also needed to trade hands with a phantom wielding, take a wild guess, a hook. In addition to these new enemy types, other features were added to shake things up, but not in the crazy Kamiya way. These included a new camera angle that would trigger during combat, providing a more over-the-shoulder viewpoint, a red laser sight for more accurate aiming, quick-time events, and even selectable dialogue choices. At certain points in the game, players would have been able to choose what Leon would say in certain situations, with some responses even having far-reaching consequences, according to Hiroyuki Kobayashi in that same EGM interview. One thing that the Fog and Hookman phases had in common was being known by different monikers between both the public and Capcom's internal teams. Once again, Hookman is a descriptor given by fans, whereas Kawamura stated that inside the madhouse that was Production Studio 4, it was known as Hallucination. While Leon did have to deal with physical forces like hook enthusiasts, the true threat was a struggle with a form of psychosis caused by another mysterious virus. This idea was presented by the team having to render two different versions of the same environment, a real world and a hallucinatory one, which were swapped via hidden checkpoints that players would unwittingly trigger. Kawamura said there are a few different inspirations for this idea: the seminal psychological thriller Jacob's Ladder, the less than seminal Lost Souls, and the growing popularity of Silent Hill. He wanted this to be the scariest Resident Evil of all time, saying to Eurogamer in a 2015 interview that he recalled telling Shibata that, "If we want to pursue pure horror, we need to find an unexplainable concept. Let's create a setting that doesn't revolve around science or reason." The Hallucination Man version then made its first public debut at E3 2003, with Mikami appearing via a video message who first trolled the audience with a content-bereft teaser trailer before then presenting a more pants-wetting extended cut. What a showman! At the end of the presentation, Mikami then assured the rabid crowd that progress in RE4 was going smoothly, which, try not to be shocked here, it absolutely super wasn't. While a great idea in theory, combining Eternal Darkness's sanity effects, Silent Hill's dual worlds, and meaty RE-style gunplay, on a technical and logistical level, this version of Resident Evil 4 had set itself up for disaster. Making 2 versions of every single asset was going to be more than a tall order, something that Kawamura explained to Eurogamer in that same interview. Even if we did have the budget, it was almost impossible to cram all of that into the GameCube's memory. We couldn't even add any monsters. With those technological restrictions in place, there was a very brief period of time where the team were considering implementing just one single persistent enemy for the entire game, most likely Hookman, but this was quickly scrapped. In fact, this entire version of the game was thrown into the bin. I'm gonna miss you, Hookie. So the team were back to square one. Now, before we get to the main event, there's one last prototype of RE4 that's not so widely known, making it perhaps the most mysterious of all. Referred to as simply Resident Evil Zombie, this was the team throwing up their hands and attempting to just go back to the classic trappings, familiar settings, and the aforementioned undead, a revelation that once again comes from that EGM interview with Kobayashi. There is some info via an interview at crimsonhead.com that, in addition to the standard zombies, there was going to be a new enemy type called the Daba Men, who would have been controlled by parasitic organisms. Daba means pack horse in Japanese, which is eerily similar to the ganados, or livestock, from the final version of RE4 that took place in Spain. I mean rural Europe. This version didn't last very long, and when it was quickly abandoned, Mikami decided he had had enough. He was under immense pressure to deliver a blockbuster game, had already made numerous promises to both the press and fans alike, and couldn't just do the lazy thing by relying on tired series tropes. The move to Nintendo exclusivity, a decision he had been a big part of, had also hurt the brand, because while his own remake had been a critical success and had sold 1,350,000 copies, that was still a huge dip from RE2's 4.9 and RE3's 3.5. In later interviews, Mikami cited RE0 as the franchise's lowest point. That's a little rich, as its worldwide tally of 1,222,000 was behind that of even Code Veronica. He also felt that overall, it played it too safe by not adding enough exciting new elements to the formula, which had started to cause some staff to get so bored working on Resident Evil that they asked for transfers onto other projects. So with all of this resting on his shoulders, Mikami did the only thing he could do. If there was a chance that RE4 could either save or end the franchise, he was going to be the one responsible. He then relieved both Shibata and Kawamura of the respective original duties, but kept Shibata on as a designer. In recent times, Kawamura lamented his inability to make his ideas work, saying to Eurogamer, "I felt ashamed for putting the other staff through this. It was disappointing and discouraging. I still think that the idea was brilliant, but I didn't have enough skill or guts to put the plan into action. I don't know if I could have done anything to prevent that occurrence. I just wanted to make a scary Biohazard game." With Kawamura gone, and because development was already so far behind, Mikami didn't want to waste time hemming and hawing over the narrative, so he drafted up the general scenario himself in reportedly just 2.5 weeks.
Jesus.
His focus was on the gameplay, not the story.
Well then, why don't you show me what a first-class script is like?
Mikami then decided to essentially throw out his own rulebook, because up until then, he had always told his employees that the #1 rule when making Resident Evil games was to scare the player. But he had decided that to make a truly groundbreaking experience, it was the gameplay that needed to be as fun as possible. The first part of this process was to take the over-the-shoulder combat view from the Hookman build and to make that the default camera for the entire game. He came to this epiphany when he had been playtesting a build of Onimusha 3, feeling that it would have been improved if the camera was just brought in a little tighter behind Jean Reno or the protagonist. This decision is often cited as one of the main reasons for RE4's success, as it set a new benchmark for smooth third-person action shooting gameplay. Mikami, however, has said it was never meant to be some milestone feature. It felt natural, oddly enough. We weren't planning on doing something innovative, but in the end, everyone kept saying we did. To us personally, we just thought that angle was better. We weren't trying to do something new or groundbreaking, there was none of that. Even with that humble explanation, the team kept building on top of that camera change. To facilitate these improved shooting mechanics, there also had to be more threatening enemies to, shoot, which logically led to introducing the swifter, weapon-wielding Ganados. As cool as all this sounds, it was still a lot to digest for many on the staff, with some feeling these changes were too far removed from classic Resident Evil, while others got downright depressed and unmotivated while working on it.
Boredom kills me.
Wait,
Mikami
why?
persevered, insisting that this was the right course of
'Cause it was
action,
just too
and in
different?
fact
They got
decided to
depressed?
shake things up even further by adding in melee attacks, suplexes, and customizable weapons. In addition, a number of story concepts from previous versions were also brought back into the mix. The European setting, Leon coming across a female character, and even a deadly virus infecting him. While staff were still unsure of the direction they were going in, under Mikami, development of RE4 kept up at an impressive pace, taking just shy of 2 years to complete. Thankfully though, when Capcom unveiled this new version at their January 2004 Gamers event in Las Vegas, the response was almost exclusively enthusiastic, although some fans were admittedly shocked and taken aback. More previews and hands-on impressions continued throughout the year, so when it finally chainsawed its way into store shelves just 12 months later, the excitement was at an all-time high. I can still recall my own palpable hype from that time, as well as just feeling the combined electricity from all the other fans from across the world when we collectively booted it up.
Oh, look at this game. I want to walk into this foreign man's house and ruin his whole day.
Reviews were incredibly positive, with many applauding the move towards action horror, as well as all the unlockable content and replayability, although some still bemoan the lack of strafing while shooting, Ashley getting into trouble a little too easily, less traditional scares, and of course, the occasional bug.
Hang on, sweetheart.
There was, however, a tiny, let's say awkward wrinkle to all this goodwill. On October 31st, 2004, Capcom announced in a rambling press release that due to changing market conditions, increased consumer satisfaction, and other vague factors, that Resident Evil 4 was also going to be launching on the PlayStation 2 later on in 2005, a move which assured that the GameCube version wouldn't sell to its maximum potential. After years of assuring gamers and the press that it was going to remain Nintendo exclusive until the end of time, you can only imagine Shinji Mikami's face when he was first given this news. This sudden swerve was apparently due to pressure from Capcom's shareholders, who were insisting that a PS2 port was required to recoup the costs from all the time wasted on abandoned builds. That desire was further backed up by RE Remake and RE Zero's disappointing numbers, with the expectation that RE4 would see similar results. They sadly weren't wrong in regards to that last point, although there was a definite improvement. As of 2007, the original GameCube version has sold around 1,600,000 copies. When staff were told they would need to start porting RE4 to Sony's rival machine, many of them doubted if it could even be done, at least without major compromises. The project had been built from the ground up with the GameCube architecture in mind, with every facet from the graphics to the audio to the level design taking advantage of custom code tailor-made for Nintendo's Indigo lunchbox. What's more is that if the team ran into any trouble, Shinji
Man, remember when Nintendo tried to compete with graphics? Remember that shit? There was an attempt being made back in the GameCube era. And they gave up on that shit.
Mikami would not be a resource they could rely on, as he left Capcom's production studio 4 as soon as he completed his duties as director. He was even considering quitting Capcom altogether, as he was that upset with the higher-ups who had ostensibly made Mikami's previous assurances of Nintendo exclusivity a lie.
All spoiled thanks to your interruption.
I mean, that only on sticker sure became especially meaningless once RE4 got ported to the likes of the Zeebo.
Hell yeah, Zeebo!
Friends and colleagues eventually convinced Mikami to stay on, but he, Kamiya, and others requested that they be given their own semi-autonomous studio as recompense. This all occurred in mid-2004, mind you, as the decision to port to the PS2 had been decided long before its public announcement. Meanwhile, the remaining staff assigned to the port job were having a tough time of it. Texture detail, lighting, sound quality, and the overall polygon count had to be sacrificed in order to get things running at an acceptable quality level. Cutscenes, which ran in real time on the GameCube and could therefore display alternate costumes, became pre-recorded movies on the PS2, which of course could not provide the same feature. The team considered rendering multiple versions of every cutscene with every costume variation to not lose this functionality, but it would have required a whole other disc to do so, and was ultimately deemed not worth the extra manufacturing costs. To hopefully balance out all these downgrades, the team added in more costumes, a new weapon, and the Separate Ways mini-campaign. So, while porting it certainly wasn't easy, the eventual sales success of the PS2 version was probably worth Mikami's ire. By the end of 2005, there were over 100 million PS2 consoles across the globe, just slightly more than the GameCube, which by the end of 2006 had amassed 19 million. With that kind of install base, it wasn't a hard thing for RE4 on the PS2 to rack up 2.3 million units in just a few months. As of 2021, Capcom has declared that RE4's lifetime total sales across all versions, and there's a lot of them, currently stands at 11.2 million, a number which was most likely bolstered by the Zeebo port.
Zeebo for life! Zeebo for life!
The story of this game's creation, the one that changed everything and influenced all subsequent Resident Evils, is an undeniable legend of the gaming industry. For one single title to go through so many iterations and guises only to come out the other side as an unmitigated success is more rare than a gleaming, fully bejeweled beer stein. And while still becoming quite successful in his own right, Shinji Mikami never completely broke free from under RE4's shadow. When he teamed up with Suda51 to make a dark and moody horror game,
This game's fucking sick too, by the way. Don't know if you guys have played this game, but this game's awesome.
EA asked them to change it to RE4, and when Mikami opened up Tango Gameworks, which he also just left, Bethesda asked him for more RE4, and that's kind of where we stand today.
I can't remember
with
the name
of
of
his
it.
2005 masterpiece, RE4's Shadow. When he teamed up with Suda51 to make a dark and moody horror game, EA asked them to change it to RE4, and when Mikami opened up Tango Gameworks, which he also just left, Bethesda asked him for more RE4. And that's kind of where we stand today. With a remake of his 2005 masterpiece now being unleashed onto the masses, you might wonder what his opinion on it is. Well, every time they re-release the old Resident Evil 4, something new has been applied to it and it's given some polish. I think they're doing a really good job. They have been really good at evolving the franchise and making sure that it adjusts to the market.
Shadows of the Damned.
When asked by VG247
I just remember him making a lot of
before the
dick jokes
remake
with
was
his-
made
with his
official,
gun.
and if there are any changes he'd like to see, Mikami replied, "It would be good if Capcom could do a great job and make the story better."
Say the line!
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Ah, Shinji, don't be like that, for you cannot improve upon perfection. A massive thanks goes out to everyone who pitched in on this episode. There's these two fine editors, Maddie for her always cromulent art, Derek and Max for their cameos, and another thanks goes to Project Umbrella for the extra research. And if you out there know of any other cliched American tales from the video game or movie industries, do let me know in the comments below or take a jet ski ride over to my Twitter. See you next time, strangers, and thanks for watching.
That was a good gosh damn video. Very much so like that. It's from Matt and Mick Muscles. I've never heard this guy. Great video though. Awesome watch. And if you guys like it too, go watch it.